You get a vote. You get a vote. You get a vote. Yep, it's the Oprah for President question this time on Poll Hub. In light of her speech at the Golden Globes, Oprah Winfrey is being talked up as running for president in 2020. Well, whether she's actually going to do that, whether it's even a possibility she would consider it, you probably won't be surprised that her name has been tossed around in polls for a while now. We're going to take a look. And it's the 50th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court decision that legalized interracial marriage. Yes, it was illegal in many states at the time. What may be most interesting, though, all these years later, is how long the public took to catch up with the court, and how much faster modern civil rights issues like same-sex marriage have moved from fringe to mainstream. Also, it's the end of Gallup's daily tracking poll of presidential approval. And you probably don't care, and probably shouldn't. We'll tell you why. Lots to discuss, so let's get started. And hi, everybody. I'm JD Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll, and this is Poll Hub.
And I'm Lee Marigoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll, and we are here in the Hancock Center at Marist College on this lovely wintry day.
It is lovely because it's slightly warmer than the deep freeze that we've suffered through for a few weeks.
We're back into double digits. We're happy for that.
Yeah, the low double digits. Oprah Winfrey running for president. I mean, we have probably since the beginning of the Marist poll thrown odd names into presidential. You know, who would you like to see as president? I think Donald Trump was probably thrown in the 90s, probably, right? Or the early 2000s.
Yeah. As a New Yorker, we couldn't resist.
So Oprah Winfrey, a real possibility. What do the polls in the past say about her as a viable candidate for office?
Well, you're talking about someone obviously with great celebrity, and that's why the buzz after her acceptance speech.
Not quite the acceptance speech.
Well, the acceptance speech of the award.
It was for an award. I mean,
just running a little ahead of the script here,
like NBC did with their tweet.
Yes, but it got so much attention. And look, we're guilty as charged when it comes to polling, and we're in the field right now, and we'll be having some numbers out. The sense of this is that she could, from some of the other polls, be ahead of Donald Trump right now. People like her, but I'm not sure that at this point people are convinced that she should make that race. So I think there's sort of a mixed message about Oprah Winfrey right now, but I think there's certainly, it's going to be an attention grabber, and she took all the oxygen out of the political room at this point.
And that's Donald Trump's trick. So it's an interesting turn.
And he didn't have a quick name for her either. I mean, we were waiting for that alliterative expression, and he didn't do it. So
I think you're also referring to the Rasmussen poll, which we don't usually regard as the most scientific poll here, because it primarily either uses some kind of IVR method or online method, and isn't completely representative of Americans as a whole. But even that poll showed Oprah Winfrey ahead of Trump by 10 points, I think, is what you were
And there's been some other polls,
recently.
I think, public policy polling, Quinnipiac, they've done some numbers
but there's
as well.
A bigger issue
and those
here.
were last year. I mean, that was they were asking, again, we talk about how long it's been, they were asking a year ago about Oprah Winfrey.
Well, because I think there is a bigger issue here. We've often looked at people who were outsiders, but always considered them still people who were politicians and had some kind of political experience. How has that really changed, or how has Donald Trump has changed all of that?
Changed the whole discussion right now, the whole narrative. Look, in American politics, for the longest time, we elected outsiders. They were called governors. Okay, we didn't elect sitting senators. John Kennedy, Barack Obama, they're the exception in our lifetimes.
You mean because they were in the Senate
they were
prior
to
in
this entire
being
century,
elected
right? I mean, in the last century.
Last century. Yeah. And they, so that's the exception that proves the rule, literally. And so you have now the outsiders who were governors. Well, outsiders now really have become post-Donald Trump, or with Donald Trump, outsiders. So Oprah Winfrey would qualify. And the question is, and if I had the answer, I would be a lot wealthier than I am, is does Oprah Winfrey, is the next presidential election going to be sort of the Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, break the mold, tear down the traditional party process and go with another outsider, a celebrity, someone who might be outside, like like an Oprah Winfrey, or do we return? Does the system reshape itself, reset itself, so that it ends up being someone, well, after Donald Trump, maybe we want something a little less dramatic, someone who might be a little more competent, someone who doesn't kind of do the stuff that Donald Trump has made famous. So we don't know the answer to that question, but it's and certainly the one that we're going to be talking about.
You mean competent in the understanding
Yes.
of government and
policy
politics.
wonk,
Right.
a policy wonk, maybe, or someone who has a sense of checks and balances. Even, I mean, there's this is a on-the-job learning process for the president, clearly,
In terms of the working of government.
Yeah.
It seems like there's always the discussion of swinging from the right to the left to the right, and that the independent voters kind of drive this swing back and forth. But there's also the swing you're suggesting is one that has happened a long time in the past. Andrew Jackson was a great first example of being a real outsider, challenging the elites back in 1836, and we all remember that well. But it seems like we're talking now about a different swing, which is the swing from outsider status, being outside of anyone who's worked in government at all. And those figures have existed. Jesse Ventura, Arnold Schwarzenegger at the state level, and even Ross Perot running as an independent and getting a lot of votes.
Back in the 90s.
Right. So do we swing from that to something that is more comforting to people who believe that having experience in government is a good thing?
I think underlying this, though, I think is the issue of is change, and the fact that people really don't think that government is working particularly well, and we all have a lot of examples of how that's the case. There's not a lot of focus on what government does well, such as infrastructure for having us develop priorities as communities and moving things forward. So there's that frustration, and so the elections that we've been seeing over the last several decades has been not only an ideological swing, but I think a swing in terms of just keeping, having something different, trying to look at government in a different way, looking candidates in a different way, and just giving them a try. And I think that was the basis of a lot of Donald Trump's support.
So when your poll, our most recent poll, says that 64% of Americans think the nation's headed in the wrong direction. It's classic right direction, wrong direction. That number hasn't really gotten better in a really long time.
No, but the people who think it have changed. So right now, Democrats, overwhelmingly hysterical about the direction of the country. When Barack Obama was president, Republicans had that sentiment. But I think you're correct, and both are correct. We've been rebounding. I mean, we've been on this roller coaster which goes back and forth, back and forth. It's been going on now for over 10 years. In our, with congressional votes and presidential votes.
Well, actually, a good 20, because it was really before Barack Obama, and he was considered, the change agent.
He was an outsider, right?
Yeah,
he'd been a senator for all of,
6
years.
an hour and a half.
Yeah, an hour and a half.
And you run against Washington. I mean, that's an old theme. Now it's something entirely different. So, I mean, I think we're really in a new chapter, and we're going to find out in not too long whether it really is a new book or just another change.
Well, because I think some of the big names,
iteration.
I mean, Oprah aside, and as you mentioned, we'll have some numbers on her next time because we're doing something with our partners, NPR and the PBS NewsHour. But I think the numbers that are being, the people that are being talked about are, Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Cuban. They tend to be people who have, not only celebrity, but, business background, or at least future directed reputations. Because I think more importantly that people are looking for someone to lead us into a direction that is more positive and more accomplished when it comes to government.
Sometimes it's hard to believe where we have been as a country or as human beings or anything when you look back in the past and you see things that have happened, and you go back to the Crusades or something and say, how could people do that? But there's some recent cases that are really that are amazing because of the parallels to things that are going on in our current age. And one is Loving versus Virginia case, famous Supreme Court case, in which the court ruled that someone who is black and someone who is white, or two people of any race, should be allowed to marry. It should be legal for them to get married. And that was a very controversial ruling because many states still made it illegal specifically for black people to marry white people.
And that you should point out is 1967, which
Yeah.
is right in the middle of the whole civil rights movement and
Right.
all those things that were going on in our society and the cultural changes and the upheaval that was going on there.
And in 1967, only 3% of all married couples were interracial. And in 2017, so 40 years later, 50 years later, 17% of all newlyweds are interracial. So there's a big change there. But one of the things that I remember doing a story when I was on NBC, and it had to do with, I think, same-sex marriage, and we were comparing the trajectory of same-sex marriage with that of interracial marriage. And sometime in the early 80s was when public opinion, in the early 80s, finally caught up with the court, where a bare majority of Americans believed it should be legal, not right or wrong, legal for someone who's black to marry someone who is white. It's amazing to think back on that, but it's also amazing to look at how quickly other things are happening now, changes from transgender and same-sex marriage and all these other things. It's incredible.
These are the issues where public opinion, socially and culturally, have shifted the most of any kind of issue that we poll and the like, and number one issues change and all that. But this is where the culture and the values have shifted. And sometimes the court has led it. Sometimes it's been electoral, in congressional and state action, but clearly in the case of Loving, I mean, we're talking 14 years. The court was 14 years ahead of public opinion, and as you say, when public opinion shifted, there was just only barely a majority. So
you went pretty quickly through those numbers, and I just want to repeat them. 3% of all married couples were interracial, and by 2017, 17% of newlyweds.
Yeah, I didn't read
so,
that correctly.
No, you did, but I really want to emphasize the fact that that is a dramatic change. Now it's a long time coming, but that certainly speaks. Those numbers certainly speak to the fact that our attitudes, our values, and our opinions about this have changed.
So why
and acceptance of it too.
So is this this delta, this difference between how long it took for Americans to accept interracial marriage to how short a time it's taken for them to accept same-sex marriage, which is kind of an apples-to-apples comparison. It's about marriage, or transgender rights, or legalization of marijuana. It's another one that's kind of really blown through really fast. Why? Why have things sped up now versus the length of time it took for public opinion to catch up with the courts or even with Congress?
I think we're very divided in partisan terms, and certainly these issues are as well, but I think there's a sense of growing tolerance people have to individual values and relationships that really hasn't occurred in prior generations. And I think we're seeing that driving this, and I think that's to me that's a major change.
And I think it is generational. Yeah. When we look at the values and attitudes of Gen Xers and millennials, and as they continue to become the larger part of American society, we're going to see more of these changes as well. I think more of a global attitude. These are two generations that have certainly traveled the world much more than their predecessors. They are also more urban. When we look at younger people, they tend to be living in urban areas where they have a greater diversity of people that they are interacting with in terms of not only their jobs, but their neighborhoods, their communities. They tend to be more spiritual rather than attached to a particular religious institution or religion itself. So there's a lot of changes that are going on generationally that I think we're seeing in the changes in our society and in the values of our society, which is also causing a good amount of upheaval, because anytime you have those kind of cultural or value changes, you're going to see this struggle from the old to the new.
Yeah, the contrast is so striking, is that at the same time that we're becoming more tolerant as individuals, it appears, by some of these numbers and some of the things that are happening, some of these trends, we're becoming more polarized politically. One of the things that stood out on interracial marriages is when we think of Loving versus Virginia, it's black and white, and that's not what interracial marriage really is in reality. In an America that is so mixed, that has so many people of so many different nationalities and heritages, so Asian and Hispanic newlyweds are actually the most likely to be intermarried, because Asians and Hispanics in this classification, if we're going to talk about race in this way.
And people of color.
And people of color. But the growth in intermarriage has been driven by black and white newlyweds. And the biggest change here has been 5% of those newlyweds in 1980 to 18% in 2015. It's just this huge change that has happened between the kind of, I hate to boil it down to this, but the kind of the classic way we see race, which is through black and white, as opposed to seeing race as this much more multivariate thing where we're all,
although
part of this
I think
big soup.
I may have the decades not correct, but I'm thinking of the late 50s, early 60s. I Love Lucy was a really big deal because you had, a white woman who was married to a Cuban. Yeah, and that was a shock. That was incredible.
I'm trying to remember when Guess Who's Coming to Dinner.
Well, that would have been, in the
That was
early
in the 60s.
65, 64.
But that was a multiracial relationship.
Yeah,
that was being,
and it was a scandalous film at the time.
And that was
in
the
many places,
whole the whole tension in that movie is about the very issue that we're talking about. But so then one of the questions we have to ask in all this is, sure, it's generational change and people are more tolerant and the like. But I think also in all these issues, one of the driving forces is that people as Barb said, their daily interactions. You just know more people who fall into these categories because there are more of them, and you then meet them and interact with them, and you sort of get away from some of the traditional stereotypes and what have you, so that it becomes some acceptance. But it's slow. It's very slow, particularly on this issue. It was.
So we had big news in the polling community this past week or so. Gallup, who has been doing a daily tracking poll for quite some time now, has decided and announced that they will now be doing a presidential approval rating weekly instead of daily. Is this a big deal? Should we be worried?
Do we care, Lee?
I care, but I suspect I'm not.
You're in the minority, maybe?
Yeah, maybe on that. But, I think, first of all, when you're talking, let's say, about Donald Trump as an approval rating, you're not getting daily swings. You're barely getting weekly swings. I'm not even sure we're getting monthly numbers. So, people are not...
Because he has a very strong base, and that has been supportive of him and pretty steady.
And a very strong anti-base. I mean, the divide is
and so that's
powerful.
that's where it's been almost from day one of the Trump administration. But that's probably not the point why Gallup did this. But from a methodological standpoint, and certainly Gallup, is a wonderful organization when it comes to transparency, and the folks who do the polling there, Frank Newport and others who we know very well, and certainly, terrific in terms of maintaining the standards that we adhere to and believe in as well. I'm thinking also, though, we talk about moving from poll to poll, and here you're saying, well, but it's a smaller sample, and they're not going to do it as frequently. And I think of the opposite. If you're not doing it well, the more people you interview, the bigger the sample, the more error you're introducing. So I don't worry about 1,500 in a national sample like they're using in this one, coming down from 3,000 or what it was. I want to know how they're picking them. And is it a good sample? Is it a representative sample? Because in this case, smaller is maybe just as good as larger, and we don't need to drill down every day anyway in the numbers.
And we don't really need the frequency, the daily frequency, because I think also when we have daily frequency of polls, all we're seeing are kind of the blips. In other words, the statistical difference in the estimates. And so what may be a point up or a point down or 3 points up or 2 points down is absolutely irrelevant.
Statistically, it doesn't mean anything.
So
aren't we better off then not having this daily poll that tempts people in the media or the public to
constantly gauge,
constantly
take the
gauge
pulse.
and make a make errors in judgment about that, because basically they're assuming that, this number must be right. Well, it is right, but it's within a margin of error, and it's a statistical anomaly. And tell me what's happening month to month. I mean, no business would run, on a daily approval rating.
Except news, right?
Well,
News ratings.
they're daily ratings.
But if you have a dozen organizations clocking even an election, tracking polls right before an election, and they're, the electorate's going to look a lot more volatile if you have all these different organizations using different methodologies and what have you. Here we've got a source that's reliable, dependable. It can be looked at and respected and trusted. So I'm good with this.
So the bottom line is the Republic will survive a weekly presidential approval rating from Gallup.
That's correct.
And that will be the last word for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and we, as always, are very grateful to our executive producer, Mary Griffith.
And we encourage people to send questions about topics you want us to talk about on this podcast, but also things you might want us to poll about, which not only become wider news, but we can also use here too.
And you send those questions to pollhub@marist.edu.
Yes, you do.
Check out Poll Hub on social media. We are every place that you would be. At Marist Poll on Twitter. We're on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram. And don't forget, look down at your device when you're listening to this now. Look down. Okay. See the button? Subscribe. Tap it. Thank you. And also rate us if you'd like. Anything from 1 to 5 stars. And I won't put my finger on the scale as I've done every week.
5 is high.
5 is high.
Okay,
1 is low.
sure.
And I'll just leave it up to people to decide how much they like us.